June 4, 1943. Camp Mexia, Texas. Behind barbed wire stretched across the scorched earth of central Texas, 2,000 German prisoners of war stood in formation under a sun that felt like punishment itself. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, former artillery officer of the Wehrmacht's 21st Panzer Division, captured at Kasserine Pass, watched the horizon with the disciplined posture of a man trained never to show weakness. He had been taught that America was a nation of mongrels, incapable of discipline, drowning in racial chaos and cultural decay. The propaganda ministry had been clear. The enemy possessed industrial might but lacked soul, lacked Kultur, lacked the spiritual unity that only a true Volk could achieve. That evening, as the camp's makeshift speakers crackled to life for the weekly radio broadcast, Richter stood near the fence with 40 other prisoners. The voice of an American announcer introduced something called swing music from New York City. What followed shattered every certainty Richter had carried across the Atlantic. A saxophone wailed with impossible freedom. A woman's voice, Billie Holiday, sang with a pain and beauty that seemed to contain entire universes of human experience. Richter's hands trembled. We'd never heard voices like that. The German prisoners at Camp Mexia represented the Wehrmacht's ideological core, men raised in a system that had taught them music was either martial precision or romantic nationalism, either Wagner's mythological grandeur or the collective folk songs of the Vaterland. Music served the state. Music unified the race. Music was discipline made audible. Klaus Richter himself had been a competent violinist in Berlin before the war, performing Beethoven and Brahms in small concert halls where the audience stood rigid, applauding only at designated moments. Music was vertical, descending from composer to performer to listener in a hierarchy as fixed as military rank. Improvisation was chaos. Jazz was entartete music, degenerate music, the corrupt product of racial mixing, a symbol of everything the Reich opposed. The American guards at Camp Mexia seemed strangely indifferent to ideology. They organized work details with casual efficiency, distributed rations with mechanical fairness, and largely left the prisoners to self-governance within the wire. But they also introduced something the Germans found bewildering: cultural programming, books, newspapers, and above all, music. The camp commandant, Colonel James Patterson, believed in a peculiar form of re-education, not through lectures or propaganda, but through exposure. Let them hear what freedom sounds like, he told his staff. Let them decide for themselves what it means. Initially, the prisoners resisted. When the first broadcasts of American popular music filled the compound, many turned away in disgust. Oberleutnant Hans Steiner, a former music critic from Hamburg, declared it rhythmic barbarism, proof of cultural collapse. The sounds seemed deliberately formless, lacking the structured development of proper composition. Where was the thematic unity? Where was the progression from tension to resolution that gave meaning to musical narrative? But something happened that the prisoners hadn't anticipated. The music wouldn't leave their minds. Richter found himself humming melodies he'd heard only once. At night, lying on his bunk, he heard again that saxophone solo, notes that seemed to argue with each other, to question and answer in the same breath. The woman's voice returned to him, not delivering a message but being the message, transforming pain into something that transcended pain. The younger prisoners began gathering near the speakers each evening. They didn't speak about it during daylight hours, maintaining the fiction of ideological purity, but after dusk they listened, and slowly, their certainty began to crack. By August 1943, an underground transformation was occurring within Camp Mexia's wire perimeter. Richter noticed it first among the musicians. 12 prisoners who had been professional or semi-professional performers before conscription. They had formed a small orchestra early in their captivity, performing Strauss waltzes and Schubert Lieder for Sunday concerts, maintaining the dignity of German culture in exile. Then came the night when Private Werner Koch, a 22-year-old trumpeter from Munich, stayed behind after everyone had returned to barracks. The American guards had left a radio playing in the recreation building. Koch stood outside the window for 2 hours, listening to a broadcast from the Apollo Theater in Harlem. When he finally walked back through the darkened compound, his face carried an expression Richter had never seen on it before. Not quite joy, not quite pain, but something that contained both. They make the instrument speak, Koch whispered to Richter that night. Not play, speak, like the trumpet is arguing with God. The concept was incomprehensible within their training. German military music had taught them that brass instruments declared victories, announced charges, marked ceremonies. The trumpet was authority-made sound. But in this American jazz, the trumpet seemed to be questioning authority itself, testing boundaries, pushing against every constraint. Steiner, the former critic, began keeping a secret journal. "What we are hearing," he wrote in carefully concealed notebooks, "is not merely music but a sonic representation of a fundamentally different social order. In our music, the individual serves the composition serves the nation. Every note is predetermined, every performer executing instructions laid down by a singular creative authority, the composer as Führer of sound. But in this American music," his entry continued, "the structure exists only to create space for individual expression. The composition is a platform, not a prison. Each musician adds their own voice, not in chaos, but in spontaneous coordination. They listen to each other, they respond, they create collectively while remaining distinct individuals. It is," here his handwriting showed hesitation, the pen hovering, "it is the sound of democracy, and it is beautiful in a way our music never was." The confession terrified him. He tore out the page, then retrieved it from the trash, folded it carefully, and hid it inside his violin case. Some truths, once recognized, could not be unlearned. September 1943. The first rehearsal. Werner Koch approached Richter with a request that bordered on treason. "I want to learn this music," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no zealous Nazi loyalists were within earshot. "Will you help me organize the others?" The risk was substantial. The camp contained hardcore SS prisoners who maintained informal surveillance on suspected ideological weakness. To openly practice American music could be interpreted as cultural betrayal, but Richter recognized something in Koch's eyes, the same thing he'd felt listening to that first Billie Holiday recording. A hunger for something they'd been taught didn't exist. Within a week, 7 musicians had secretly agreed. They approached one of the American guards, Corporal James Washington, a black soldier from Chicago who had played saxophone in South Side clubs before enlistment. Washington initially seemed suspicious of the request. "You boys spent years being told that jazz was monkey music," he said flatly. "Now you want me to teach you?" Richter, whose English was functional, tried to explain. "We want to understand," he said. "We hear something in this music, something we cannot name, something that makes what we believed seem—" He searched for the word, "incomplete." Washington studied them for a long moment. Then he laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine surprise. "All right," he said, "but I'm not teaching you to copy jazz. That defeats the whole purpose. I'm teaching you to find your own voice, and let me tell you, that's going to be harder than any march you ever memorized." The first session took place in a storage building after evening roll call. Washington brought his own saxophone and a portable record player borrowed from the officers' quarters. He played them a Count Basie recording, then stopped it after 8 bars. "What did you hear?" he asked. The Germans looked at each other uncertainly. "A piano introduction," Steiner offered. 4 bars establishing the key, then 4 bars of rhythmic pattern. Washington shook his head. "You heard the structure. Now listen again, and hear what the piano player is saying." He played it again. This time Richter heard something different. The piano wasn't just establishing a key, it was setting a mood, inviting conversation, creating an emotional space. It was the difference between a military briefing and a human conversation. Everything they knew about music had just become obsolete. The psychological effect of learning jazz proved more disorienting than the physical hardships of captivity. The German musicians had spent their entire lives perfecting precision, the ability to execute written notation with mechanical accuracy. Their value as musicians had always been measured by how perfectly they could disappear into the composer's intentions. Jazz demanded the opposite. Washington's first instruction was, "Forget the music stands. We're learning this by ear." For men trained in conservatories where reading music was as fundamental as reading words, this felt like being asked to think without language. Koch struggled for 2 weeks before he could play even a simple blues scale without reverting to classical fingering. His training kept pulling him toward correct technique, toward the pure tone and precise articulation he'd spent years developing. Washington would stop him repeatedly. "You're playing it right," he'd say, "but you're not playing it true. There's a difference." The concept of playing true versus playing right opened an abyss beneath their certainty. In German musical education, truth and correctness were identical. Truth was fidelity to the score, to the composer's documented intentions, to the established interpretation of masters. But here was an American soldier suggesting that technical correctness could actually be a form of dishonesty. Steiner experienced what he would later describe as a spiritual crisis. He wrote, "If music can be true without being correct, what else have we been wrong about? We were taught that truth exists in precision, in following the superior vision of the leader, in subordinating individual perception to collective will. But this music suggests the opposite, that truth emerges from individual expression within consensual structures, that the highest beauty comes not from perfect obedience, but from authentic voices in spontaneous coordination." The implications terrified him. If the Americans were right about music, what else were they right about? Democracy? Individual freedom? The equality of races? Meanwhile, other prisoners began to notice the musicians' clandestine gatherings. Rumors spread. One evening, 3 SS officers confronted Richter in the barracks. "We hear you're learning nigger music," said the senior man, a former Gestapo investigator named Hoffman. "Is this true?" Richter met his gaze. "I'm learning American music," he said carefully. "Colonel Patterson has authorized cultural education." "Cultural re-education," Hoffman corrected coldly. "Don't think we don't see what's happening. You're betraying everything we fought for." Richter didn't answer, because part of him knew Hoffman was right. November 1943. The letter home. The camp's mail censors began noticing a pattern. Several German prisoners, including Richter, were writing letters to family members in Germany that focused unusually on music. On the surface, these letters seemed innocuous. Descriptions of camp concerts, nostalgic references to Berlin's cultural life before the war. But Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a military intelligence officer assigned to monitor POW correspondence, recognized something deeper. "They're processing ideological trauma through aesthetic language," she reported to Colonel Patterson. "Look at this passage from Hauptmann Richter. I have discovered that what we called chaos may actually be a higher form of order, one that trusts the individual to find structure rather than imposing it from above." He's not talking about music. He's talking about governance. Patterson nodded slowly. "And they're probably not conscious of it themselves. That's how re-education actually works. Not through argument, but through experience that contradicts indoctrination." Mitchell's analysis went deeper. She had studied music theory at Radcliffe before the war, and recognized that jazz represented something the Nazis literally couldn't comprehend within their ideological framework. Their entire system is built on the idea that superior individuals, composers, leaders, visionaries, create frameworks that lesser individuals execute, she explained. Jazz inverts that completely. The framework in jazz is minimal, just chord changes and rhythmic feel. Everything else is created in real time by individuals listening and responding to each other as equals. "It's a sonic model of democratic society," Patterson said. "Exactly. And once you've experienced that model working, once you've felt the beauty it can create, it becomes very difficult to believe that authoritarian models are superior, because you've lived the alternative, even if only in music." Meanwhile, in Germany, Richter's wife Anna received his letters with growing confusion. Klaus had always written with military precision, status reports on his health, inquiries about household matters, reassurances of his ideological commitment. But these new letters seemed written by a different man. He described listening to music that argues with itself and reaches beautiful conclusions, and harmonies that shouldn't work, but somehow create meanings that proper harmonies cannot express. Anna showed the letters to her neighbor, who showed them to his brother, who happened to be a regional party official. Within weeks, a file had been opened on Hauptmann Klaus Richter, flagged for possible ideological corruption. Recommend immediate repatriation for evaluation upon return to Reich. The music was starting to have consequences beyond the wire. January 1944. The performance decision. Colonel Patterson proposed something unprecedented. A joint concert featuring both the German prisoners' orchestra and American military musicians from the camp's Negro unit. The performance would be held for both prisoners and guards, with repertoire from both traditions, German classical works followed by American jazz standards. The proposal ignited immediate controversy. Among the Americans, white officers objected to mixing races in public performance. Among the Germans, Nazi loyalists saw it as the final humiliation. Forced to collaborate with those they'd been taught were subhuman. Richter faced an impossible choice. Participating meant openly breaking with National Socialist ideology, in a way that could never be taken back. Refusing meant turning away from the most profound artistic experience of his life. He held a secret meeting with the other musician prisoners to discuss the decision. "If we do this," Hoffman warned, having infiltrated the meeting, "you will be marked, not just by our comrades here, but by everyone back home who hears of it. Your families will face questions. Your futures, if any of us have futures, will be compromised." Steiner spoke up. "And if we don't do it? We go home having learned that everything we believed about cultural superiority was a lie, but we pretend we never learned it. We live the rest of our lives performing music we now know is spiritually dead?" Young Koch added quietly, "I used to think my trumpet's purpose was to announce victories. Now I understand it can do something more important. It can tell truth, even uncomfortable truth, especially uncomfortable truth." The vote was 5 in favor, 2 against. Richter abstained, then changed his vote to yes. "We are already prisoners," he said finally. "The only freedom we have left is the freedom to choose what we believe. They can take everything else, but not that." The following week, Corporal Washington began intensive rehearsals with the combined ensemble. The German musicians would perform Beethoven's 7th Symphony, second movement, the famous allegretto that had become associated with resistance against tyranny. The American musicians would follow with Duke Ellington's Mood Indigo and a Louis Armstrong arrangement. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Beethoven had represented German cultural supremacy and Nazi ideology, the supreme genius of Aryan civilization. But Beethoven had also been claimed by democracies as a voice of human liberation. And now German prisoners would perform his music not as a statement of superiority, but as a bridge toward understanding. What came after would test everything they'd learned about the relationship between beauty and truth. February 14, 1944, Valentine's Day concert. The makeshift auditorium, really just a cleared storage building with borrowed chairs, held 300 people, 200 German prisoners, 75 American guards and support staff, and 25 civilian observers, including Red Cross representatives and military journalists. The atmosphere carried the tension of a diplomatic negotiation conducted through music. Richter stood backstage, violin in hand, watching through a gap in the curtain as the audience filed in. The Germans sat on one side, Americans on the other, a segregation that wasn't officially mandated but happened automatically. The visual representation of everything music was supposed to overcome. The German orchestra opened with Beethoven. Richter had never performed with such intense awareness of meaning beyond notes. Each phrase of the allegretto, with its dark, processional quality, seemed to ask questions about the past 3 years. What had they fought for? What had they believed? What did those beliefs look like now? From behind barbed wire in Texas, performing for former enemies who had treated them with more humanity than their own government had shown to conquered peoples. The performance was technically impeccable but emotionally devastating. When the final notes faded, there was silence. Not the silence of incomprehension, but of recognition. Several American officers looked visibly moved. Some of the German prisoners were weeping quietly. Then Corporal Washington's ensemble took the stage. 6 black musicians from various service units assembled for this single performance. Washington announced, "We're going to play Mood Indigo, composed by Duke Ellington." For those who don't know, Duke writes music that's supposed to sound like colors. This one's blue, but it's a blue that contains joy. What followed was a revelation. The German musicians had heard jazz recordings, had even begun learning basic techniques, but they'd never witnessed it performed live by masters. Washington's saxophone didn't just play the melody, it inhabited the melody, bent it, questioned it, transformed it into something that seemed to discover itself in real time. The other musicians responded with their own voices. Piano commenting on saxophone, trumpet answering piano, drums holding space for all of them, while adding rhythmic complexity that somehow made everything clearer. It was democracy made audible. Individual voices maintaining distinct identities while creating unified meaning. Koch leaned toward Richter and whispered, "This is what we could never do. We can play together. They can be together." In that moment, the cultural war ended. Not with victory or defeat, but with understanding that the war itself had been based on false premises. March 1944. The secret recording. Lieutenant Mitchell's intelligence operation took an unexpected turn. She had initially been monitoring prisoner mail for security threats. Now she found herself documenting something else, evidence of profound ideological transformation occurring through cultural exposure. She arranged for a wire recorder to capture the Valentine's concert and subsequent rehearsal sessions. The recordings would be studied by military psychologists and cultural officers developing post-war occupation strategies. How do you denazify a population? The question had become urgent as Allied victory seemed increasingly inevitable. Traditional propaganda doesn't work, Mitchell explained in her classified report. Telling people their beliefs are wrong only strengthens resistance. But giving them experiences that contradict their ideology, experiences they can't deny because they've lived them personally, that creates genuine transformation. The recordings captured something remarkable. German prisoners spontaneously joining American musicians in jam sessions, creating hybrid performances where classical technique merged with jazz improvisation, Richter playing violin solos over blues progressions, Koch's trumpet engaging in musical conversations with Washington's saxophone, Steiner arranging swing versions of German folk songs. These weren't performances of captured music. They were dialogues, cultural exchange in its purest form. But the recordings also captured darker elements. In one session, Hoffman and 3 other Nazi loyalists interrupted a rehearsal, shouting denunciations in German. Washington didn't understand the words but recognized the tone. He stood between the protesters and the musicians, his saxophone still in hand. "In this room," Washington said calmly, "we speak music. If you don't want to speak music, there's the door." The confrontation ended without violence, but it marked a clear split within the prisoner population. About 30% remained ideologically committed to Nazism. Another 30% had fully embraced re-education. The remaining 40% existed in a state of confused transition, unable to return to their former beliefs, but uncertain about accepting new ones. Mitchell's report concluded, "Music has accomplished what traditional propaganda could not. It has created experiential proof that racial theories are false. German musicians have discovered that Black American artists possess not just technical skill but creative genius that equals or exceeds European classical traditions. This is not a fact they were told. It is a fact they experienced. And experience cannot be unexperienced." The question became, what would these men do with their experience once the war ended? Would they carry these insights back to Germany? Or would the pressure of returning to a Nazi-controlled society force them to bury what they'd learned? May 1944. Letters intercepted. German military intelligence intercepted several letters from Camp Mexia before they reached families. The content alarmed authorities sufficiently to generate a classified memorandum from the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, Reich Security Main Office, to camp commandants on all fronts. American re-education programs utilizing cultural exposure have been identified as dangerous to ideological cohesion. Prisoners showing signs of ideological corruption must be isolated upon repatriation. But by May 1944, repatriation was becoming hypothetical. The war was turning decisively against Germany. D-Day was weeks away. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose, but how completely. Richter received a letter from his wife, the last one that would get through before communications became impossible. Anna wrote, "The city is being bombed nightly. Greta's husband was killed at Anzio. Heinrich's son is missing in Russia. Your father says the war is lost, but we must fight anyway because surrender means destruction. Klaus, I don't know what you're experiencing in America, but from here it looks like everything we believed was a lie that's cost us everything." The letter arrived the same week that Camp Mexia received news of D-Day. The invasion of France meant the war would end. Maybe by Christmas, some optimists said. The prisoners faced a paradox. Victory for their captors meant survival and eventual return home. Victory for their homeland, increasingly impossible anyway, meant remaining prisoners indefinitely in a losing cause. Washington noticed the change in the musicians. "You boys are playing different," he observed during rehearsal. "Sadder maybe, or maybe just more honest." Richter tried to explain. "We came here as soldiers of the Reich. We will return, if we return, as witnesses to the Reich's failure. Everything that happens here, everything we learn, we carry as evidence against our former beliefs. That is a heavy thing to carry." "Knowledge usually is," Washington replied. "That's why some people prefer not to have it." The final concert before summer was scheduled for June 15th. The program would feature the most ambitious musical fusion yet attempted, a jazz arrangement of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, followed by a German orchestral interpretation of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. The performances would represent something unprecedented, not German or American music, but something genuinely hybrid, the creation of a third culture, born from dialogue rather than conquest. But whether that culture could survive outside the unique conditions of Camp Mexia remained uncertain. June 15, 1944. The Fusion Concert. Wagner's Valkyries had always represented Germanic mythology at its most triumphant, warrior maidens descending from Valhalla to choose the heroic dead. In Nazi ideology, the piece embodied racial destiny and martial glory. Washington's jazz arrangement transformed it into something else entirely. The familiar opening brass fanfare was stated, then deconstructed, broken into individual motifs that each musician developed independently before reconverging. The martial precision became rhythmic complexity. The triumphant certainty became questioning exploration. What had been an anthem of supremacy became a conversation about power, glory, and the human costs of both. The German prisoners watched with complex emotions. Many felt they were witnessing something sacrilegious, their culture's most sacred music being transformed, perhaps violated. But others, including Richter, recognized something different. Not violation, but liberation. Wagner's music was being freed from the ideological prison the Reich had built around it. When the piece concluded, the applause was uncertain. Some enthusiastic, some hesitant, some withheld entirely. Hoffman and his loyalists sat with arms crossed, faces rigid with disapproval. Then came the German orchestra's interpretation of Gershwin. If the jazz Wagner had been controversial, this was openly revolutionary. Rhapsody in Blue had been banned in Nazi Germany as degenerate. Jewish composer, jazz influences, American decadence. Performing it was a political act. Steiner conducted. He had spent weeks with the score, initially approaching it as he would any classical work, analyzing structure, identifying themes, planning interpretations. But Gershwin's piece resisted classical analysis. It was written to be structured yet spontaneous, composed yet improvisatory. Playing it correctly meant playing it with a freedom their training had never taught them. The clarinet glissando that opens the piece, that sliding bluesy entrance, was performed by Koch with a technical precision that somehow captured improvisatory spirit. The piece built through its famous themes, the orchestra now capable of rhythmic flexibility they'd learned from months of jazz exposure. When they reached the piece's climax, that gorgeous, romantic theme that Gershwin called the Song of New York, something broke in the room. American soldiers were smiling broadly. Some German prisoners were crying. The music was performing integration that politics made impossible. After the final chord faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then Corporal Washington stood and began applauding. Other Americans joined. Then, slowly, defiantly, some German prisoners stood as well, applauding their own comrades' performance of music their government had called corrupt. Cultural walls were falling, one note at a time. August 1944, the end of innocence. News from Europe shattered the fragile world Camp Mexia had created. The July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler had failed, leading to widespread purges. Worse, reports began reaching the West about camps in Poland. Not prisoner of war camps, but something else. Something the mind resisted comprehending. Auschwitz, Treblinka, names that would come to mean horror beyond description. Lieutenant Mitchell received classified briefings about what Allied forces were discovering as they advanced. She struggled with how much to share with the German prisoners. Some, like Richter and his musicians, had clearly broken with Nazi ideology. They deserved to know what that ideology had actually done, but the truth was so extreme that she feared it might seem like propaganda, might even drive conflicted prisoners back into denial and defensive nationalism. She decided to let them learn gradually, through intercepted letters and overheard conversations among American personnel. Let the truth seep in rather than crash down. Richter learned about the death camps from a guard who didn't realize he was within earshot. The guard was reading a Stars and Stripes article about Majdanek, the first major camp liberated by Soviet forces. The description included details about gas chambers, about systematic industrial murder, about carefully maintained records of millions killed. Richter stood frozen, his violin hanging from his hand. His first reaction was denial. Allied propaganda, exaggerations, impossible. Then he remembered the propaganda he'd been fed about Americans, about democracy, about jazz. All lies. If they'd lied about something as trivial as music, what else had they lied about? That night, he gathered the musicians. "We need to talk about what we've been learning," he said quietly. "Not about music, about what we fought for, what we believed, what that belief actually meant in the world." The conversation lasted until dawn. They discussed ideology they'd accepted without examination, hatreds they'd absorbed without questioning, a war they'd fought without understanding its true purposes. Steiner wept openly. Koch sat in silence, his face ashen. "The music was telling us," Steiner finally said. "That's why they banned it. Not because it was chaotic or degenerate, but because it was truthful. It was the sound of human beings treating each other as equals, creating beauty through mutual respect. Everything we were taught contradicted that truth. And now we know," Richter added quietly, "that our ideology didn't just contradict truth, it created hell." The question was, what would they do with that knowledge? December 1944, the final performance. As autumn turned to winter, word came that the war would end within months. Germany was collapsing on all fronts. Prisoners at Camp Mexia faced the reality that they would soon return to a country that no longer existed in the form they'd known. Defeated, occupied, divided, forced to confront crimes committed in its name. Colonel Patterson authorized one final concert, framed as a Christmas program but understood by all as a farewell. The musicians had 6 weeks to prepare. They decided on a program that would tell their story. Beethoven's Ode to Joy from the Ninth Symphony, followed by a jazz medley of spirituals, concluding with a co-performance of Silent Night in both classical and jazz arrangements. The choice of Ode to Joy was deliberate and painful. Schiller's text, "All men become brothers," had been appropriated by the Reich as affirmation of Aryan unity. But the words actually proclaimed universal brotherhood. The Germans would reclaim the piece's original meaning, performing it as an act of repudiation. On December 22, 1944, before an audience that now included war correspondents and Red Cross officials, the combined ensemble performed. When they reached the choral section, prisoners singing Schiller's words in German, the meaning was devastating. Alle Menschen werden Brüder. All human beings become brothers. Not all Aryans, not all Germans, all humans. Richter played violin with tears streaming down his face. He was performing not as a German musician, but as a human being who had learned, through music, what that meant. The notes carried everything: grief for what he'd believed, shame for what those beliefs had enabled, gratitude for having learned differently, fear about facing a destroyed homeland with new understanding. Then came the spirituals. Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, performed by Washington's ensemble with German musicians joining. These were songs born from slavery, from oppression, from peoples the Reich had classified as subhuman. Germans were now learning them, honoring them, recognizing their profound beauty and spiritual depth. The final Silent Night, originally German, now claimed by all, blended classical strings and jazz brass into a unified whole. It was Christmas 1944, and in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, enemies had become colleagues, captors had become teachers, and music had accomplished what warfare could not. It had created understanding where ideology had demanded hatred. When the final note faded, no one moved. The silence contained recognition of something unrepeatable and irreplaceable. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The prisoners of Camp Mexia were not repatriated immediately. Germany was devastated, occupied, unable to receive thousands of returning POWs. Richter and his fellow musicians remained in Texas through the summer, now technically disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners, awaiting transport to an uncertain future. On their last night in America, the musicians performed informally. No audience, no program, just playing for themselves. They mixed Beethoven and blues, Bach and swing, creating music that belonged to no single tradition because it belonged to all of them. Corporal Washington, who would be discharged the following month, sat with them afterward. "What are you going to do when you get back?" he asked Richter. "I'm going to teach," Richter replied. "Music primarily, but not music as I was taught it, as perfection of technique in service to ideology. I'll teach it as conversation, as dialogue, as the most human thing we do." "They'll resist that," Washington warned. "People who lost the war won't want to be told their culture was wrong too." "I won't tell them it was wrong," Richter said. "I'll play them what I learned. Let them hear for themselves. The same way you taught us, through experience, not argument." In October 1945, Klaus Richter returned to a Germany that barely resembled the nation he'd left. Berlin was ruins. The Reich was ash. Millions were dead. The camps had been liberated, their horrors documented and undeniable. He found his family alive, barely. His wife Anna, thin and traumatized, held him at the door of their bombed apartment building. "Who are you now?" she asked. "Are you the man who left or someone else?" "Someone else," he said quietly, "but someone better." He carried his violin, somehow preserved through captivity and chaos, to what remained of the conservatory where he'd once studied. Classes were resuming in improvised spaces, students desperate for normalcy, for beauty, for anything beyond rubble and hunger. On his first day teaching, Richter played them a blues scale. They looked at him with confusion and suspicion. "This is American music," he explained. "Once we were told it was degenerate, but it taught me what music really is, not power made audible, but humanity made audible. Let me teach you voices you've never heard. Let me teach you that freedom has a sound." They came as prisoners of ideology and returned as students of humanity. In the space between barbed wire and liberation, between defeat and understanding, music revealed what propaganda had concealed, that beauty recognizes no borders, genius belongs to no race, and the highest form of culture is not that which proves superiority, but that which celebrates our shared capacity for transcendence. If this story made you reflect on how art can transform belief, how listening can change certainty, and how the courage to learn from former enemies might be the most difficult victory of all, then its purpose is fulfilled. Because what we learn through beauty we cannot unlearn, and what we cannot unlearn we must pass forward.